Well, I mean, you're going to edit this, right?
Yes. My name is Tom Warkentin. I'm a science teacher at Albany High School in Albany, New York. And I've been brought down here to collaborate with Karen Warkentin, who I'm sitting with right here.
Hi.
And Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, is an associate professor at Boston University.
Yep, associate professor of biology, Boston University.
Great. And we are down here in Panama, Gamboa, Panama, at Sharon's apartment right now, where she does her research. So I'm going to start with a few questions here, going far back, all the way back to high school, if you don't mind. And my first question for Karen is, do you remember a time when you were in high school that really sparked your interest in science?
Oh, I had an awesome biology teacher in high school, Barry Daynard. He's actually my Facebook friend now, which is really cool. Yeah, and so my biology high school classes were really cool. We did one thing. So this is in a small town in Manitoba, and in the spring, southern Manitoba, there's all these sloughs, we call them, kind of like marshy, swampy ponds, really important duck habitat. But he had us go out there maybe like every week or something and take samples of the zooplankton, and then we brought them back to the lab and we looked at them under the microscope, and we saw like how it changed over the course of the spring, the abundance and the diversity and what kinds of zooplankton we were seeing. But also it was just like amazing to look at these little creatures swimming around under the microscope. So that's one thing that I remember.
Awesome. So did that have any impact on your college choice after high school, or even your decision in where you might want to go to school during high school, or perhaps what you'd want to go to school for?
Well, so it might depend on who you talk to about this, because when I was in high school, at least starting high school, I would say I was interested in a lot of things. I did not know. I mean, I loved my English classes. I was really involved in theater. I loved my biology classes. Like on some level, I could have done all kinds of things. But if you ask my mother, she would tell you that she knew I was going to be a biologist since I was a little kid, because I was, we lived in Kenya when I was a kid, and we would go to the coast, beaches for vacation. I would spend all this time like snorkeling in tide pools, and I would catch fish like pipefish, which is about the only fish that like a 6-year-old can catch without a net.
Okay.
And I'd have like these buckets of pipefish, and she would let me watch them for a while, and then I would have to put them back, and hermit crabs and all this stuff, and we found lizard eggs, and they hatched out. So that was like my first, observations of hatching, which is what I study now. And so she thought that I was going to be a biologist from watching my interactions with the natural world, even as a young child. But then also my parents got me an aquarium the Christmas that I was 12 years old, I think, and I thought this was awesome. And I had, like a community tank with these fish. And after school, I would come home, I had like a little notebook that stayed with the aquarium, and every day I would come home for like half an hour or maybe more, and I would watch the behavior of my fish, and I would take notes on their individual behavior.
How old were you when this was
I was
happening?
like 12.
Okay.
And, like to me, there was like, of course, you have an aquarium, you want to like know how the fish are doing. It like seemed to me like something that any kid would do. But I think that my mom, looking at that, was like, okay, yeah. Maybe it's not something that any kid would do, but yeah, to me that was very normal. And growing up in Kenya with, catching chameleons in my backyard, catching pipefish in the Indian Ocean when we went on holiday and stuff, I think it was very formative, and part of why I'm not just a biologist, but a tropical biologist now, because I love the richness of life down here.
What were your parents' positions? What was their job when they were in Kenya?
So my dad was an educator. My dad was a teacher and a high school principal. He's been a school superintendent. In Kenya, he was training teachers, so he's working with the Canadian International Development Agency. My mom actually was trained as a pediatric nurse, so she has, that kind of a science background. And initially she wanted to marry a scientist, but then she married a teacher, so she raised a scientist instead. Yeah, and I think in some ways she probably gave me that kind of scientific mindset, logical way of you look at stuff, you can ask a question, you can figure it out, you make observations, make deductions. Yeah, because she has, doing all kinds of science-related activities when we were little kids too. But she actually never worked since I was born, because that was what women did then. And she maybe thought that she was going to go back to work after we were in school, but then we were in Kenya, and that wasn't, she couldn't actually work there with the visa situation, and then she had some health problems after we came back to Canada that prevented her from working. So, yeah.
All right. Now back to the high school part.
Okay.
I was asking about what helped form your decision on college. So obviously we got a good story on how you became a scientist, or your first steps in becoming a scientist. Now, as far as where you went to college for undergraduate, what led you to where you ended up, and when do you first remember that decision process started?
So I think when I was in grade 12, I had decided that I was going to go to school for biology. And Barry Daynard, my high school biology teacher, I think had a lot to do with that, because I had, a few years of high school biology, and it was awesome, and he was an awesome teacher. And so I was like, I could study biology. That would be cool, right? So I looked at schools in Canada, and I looked for the best undergraduate biology program that I could find in Canada, based on the resources available to me at the time, which was this is pre-internet, right? So you'd I don't know, talk to people, there were books or magazines. There was a magazine, I think, that had some guide information about
Yes.
different programs, and then write physical letters to, I wrote to a bunch of different schools in my senior year in high school, a bunch of different universities, and I said, please send me information about your program and your admissions procedures, and I don't know, different questions that I had. University of Guelph is an awesome biology program. They actually have a College of Biological Sciences, so it's not just a biology department, it's a whole college, and they have grad school, but it has a lot of it's a really good undergraduate program, and it also probably didn't hurt that it was in another province from where my family lived, because as the oldest child and first to leave home and only girl, it's I was ready to have a little space and go and forge out and be independent. So if I had gone to University of Winnipeg or Manitoba or Brandon, which are very close, I would have had to be much less independent. Are we recording?
So yes. Okay. So after undergrad at University of Guelph.
University of Guelph, yeah.
University of Guelph. How did you decide what to do after you got your undergraduate degree?
Okay, so I actually worked for 4 years after my undergrad. So all during my undergrad, so my first summer job after my freshman year was as an interpretive naturalist in a park in northern Manitoba. So basically teaching people about nature, which I'm kind of still doing.
Sure.
Which I loved, and I worked actually every summer during my undergrad, and then I worked part-time during the year at the University of Guelph Arboretum, doing the same kind of environmental education. And that was great. I loved it. And if there had been permanent jobs available in that, I might still be doing that now. So I did that contract work, part-time for 4 years after I graduated, and, in a few different places, in provincial parks in Ontario, for Grand River Conservation Authority, also in Ontario. And I really enjoyed it, and I think I was good at it, but the state of the field then was that the people who had the long-term positions were not that much older than me, and it didn't seem like there was going to be anything long-term opening up. And so after doing it for a few years on contract work, I thought I need to do something that lasts longer than 6 months, where I have a little bit of continuity. It was going to be either I need a long-term contract, longer term job, or I'm going to go back to school. And it was kind of whichever happened first. And I went, while I was working as a naturalist, I went back to the University of Guelph, and I took Jim Bogart's herpetology class, which is a class that I had been interested in as an undergrad, but for some reason I didn't actually take it. And I did it kind of as a test to be like, oh, can I,
Could you
am I any good at this? Can I go back and do this school thing, or is this like I've just been out of it too long, and will I enjoy, still being a student again? And I did enjoy it, and I also connected me with academia again, and so because I was really interested in snakes. So I was thinking, I could study snakes. That would be cool. And so then I, could talk to Jim Bogart and ask his advice of where to apply to graduate school. So I did well in herpetology, and I liked it. And he advised me, and he gave me, there were 7 academic herpetologists in Canada at that point that you could actually go and do grad work with. And I wrote to all of them. And I really kind of wanted to work with this guy who studies snakes in British Columbia, but he didn't write me back. I don't know, maybe his lab was full. And Richard Wassersug, who was at Dalhousie at the time and studies tadpoles, wrote me a really nice, enthusiastic, kind of warm, welcoming letter, and he's like, come on and visit. I was like, okay, sure. And then I went, and we connected really well. I had a really good visit there, and so then I ended up going there for my master's, which is actually, I think, much better than if I had started out working on snakes, because working with tadpoles, there's a lot more that you can do experimentally. It's much easier to get reasonable sample sizes, and snakes eat tadpoles, and snakes eat frog eggs, and so I get to work with snakes, but my sample size is not limited by the number of snakes for most of the kinds of experiments that I do, and I can do lots of work even if I can't find snakes. So it's actually better.
All right, and then you got your master's degree.
Got my master's degree at Dalhousie, and I still liked it. So it's normal in Canada to do a master's first. I mean, very few programs do people just go right into PhDs. Even though I know in the US it's pretty common. But I think for a lot of people, doing a master's first is really the right thing. It certainly was for me. I learned about what science was. I had not done any undergraduate research, so I really kind of had no clue about what doing research would be like. But I liked it, and I was good at it. And I had traveled in Africa, actually backpacked across Africa with a couple friends when I was an undergrad, because my dad was working in Nigeria at the time. So as part of his contract, he got a ticket for me to go and visit him. And so I was like, oh, it doesn't cost me that much more to fly back from Kenya instead of Nigeria. And so, yeah, I just made this almost a year trip out of it with a couple of friends. And when I was there, and I was in in the rainforest in Africa, I was just amazed. I was like, at some point I need to work in the rainforest. And so then having gone back to school and done the master's and kind of feeling like I could handle academia, like the short commitment test worked out okay. I thought, how can I get to go to the rainforest and work in the rainforest? And then I was, into tadpoles and frogs. So I was like, how can I get somebody to pay me to go to the rainforest and play with frogs so that I can pay my rent and eat and whatever and do this. So I was like, okay, I'll do a PhD. I can, maybe someone will pay me to do a PhD and go play with frogs. So
This trip to Kenya was after your master's degree?
No, I went, so I lived in Kenya as a kid, right? And then I went back, I took a year off during my undergrad to go and visit my dad in Nigeria and then backpack across to Kenya.
Okay.
So I was like 19.
You were undergrad, okay.
Yeah, which I have to give my parents a lot of credit. Like some parents would be freaking out if their kid was like 19-year-old, I'm gonna go backpack across Africa. They're like, okay, right.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So while you were getting your master's degree, you were thinking about that experience, having been in the rainforest and wanting to do work in the rainforest at some point?
I would say it was in the back of my mind. From when I was in the rainforest in Africa, that was kind of like in the back of my mind. I want to go back to the rainforest, but I want to go not as a tourist. I want to go, I want to live there, I want to work there, I want to just really get to know that environment. But when I was doing my master's, I don't think I was that solid about it yet. I was still kind of like, yeah, I don't know if I can really do this school thing or, I was not seeing myself as a professor, or I was not seeing myself, that was still kind of far away at that point. So it was not until, probably I was well along in my master's that I started thinking about, I can do this, and I could keep doing it, and I could get to do cool things with it. So it was really kind of step by step, and I did not think, when I went to do my undergrad at Guelph, not in a million years that I would end up as a professor, that I would end up working in Panama. That I couldn't have imagined that really.
So after your master's, you took some time off?
No, after my master's, I was thinking, by the time I came to the end of my master's, I was thinking, I could, let's see if someone will pay me to go play in the rainforest.
Excellent.
Right, so, sure, let me apply to PhD programs, let's see. And I was gonna go actually to University of Florida and work with Marty Crump, but then she took an early retirement, and so then I had to do so I actually did 2 rounds of searching for a PhD program. So University of Texas, where I actually did my PhD, was in the second round of applications and interviews and whatnot to get in. And I just continued working in the lab at Dalhousie where I had gotten my master's in the interim.
Excellent. So once you got your doctorate, your PhD, now let me step back actually. What was the research you did to get your PhD?
As a PhD student?
Yes.
Okay, well this is highly relevant because it really leads directly here, right? It's the start of all the stuff we're doing now. So when I went to Texas, I knew that I wanted to work in the rainforest. It made sense to work in Latin America rather than Africa because it's just so much more logistically feasible and closer. Europeans, go to Africa. That's the close tropics for us in North America. And I really went to Texas. When I was looking for a graduate program for my PhD, I was looking for places where they're good with herpetology, good with tropical biology. I was also looking for conservation biology, which Texas, certainly at the time, was not so much of a strength, but Florida was, and I was looking also for behavioral ecology. So there was some kind of combination of those things. So when I was starting in Texas, I knew that I wanted to do field work in Latin America, in the rainforest, and the University of Texas has a field class that Larry Gilbert taught at that time in Corcovado National Park in Costa Rica. And lots of starting graduate students take it, kind of getting their feet wet in the tropical systems. So I went looking for a potential PhD project. So it was going to be something related to reproductive ecology, behavioral ecology of a neotropical frog with an interesting reproductive mode. And by that I mean a frog that did something cool that frogs in Canada don't do. Because in my herpetology class from Jim Bogart, he gave a lecture on reproductive diversity in frogs that just blew my mind. It was like, 1 hour, and I had no idea that, frog reproduction, it's amazing. Fish have really diverse reproduction, but of vertebrates, frogs, they just have extreme diversity of all kinds of weird and wonderful things. That, like as a mammal, it's really kind of hard to imagine things reproducing like that. But and frogs in Canada, they all are pretty much like frog lays its eggs in the water, goes away, tadpoles hatch, grow up, metamorphose, go onto land. It's all pretty much very close variants of that story. Here in Panama, we have terrestrial eggs and aquatic tadpoles. We have direct development on land. We have foam nests. We have parental care. We have frogs that transport their tadpoles and go back and feed them. All kinds of wild stuff. Really any of those things could have been appealing to me. So I was looking for a system I could work with. Larry Gilbert showed me this pond. It was full of red-eyed tree frogs. And they have these big, beautiful terrestrial egg masses, attached to leaves above the pond. And there were lots of them. I was like, hey, I could study this. So that was my little project for the class. And then it was my PhD. And, now it's what I do.
So
my lab is still working on them.
Right. So this course that you took in Costa Rica, that would be the genesis of what you're doing today?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Fantastic. And now
so thanks, Larry.
Yeah, absolutely. So now let's get to that. So what research are you doing today?
So we can frame it in many different ways.
Maybe the basics, where it started, where it is now, where it's going.
Yeah. So I study hatching. One of the core things. Study hatching as a critical point in the life of these frogs, right? Where all kinds of things change. So that's representative. All kinds of organisms, all kinds of animals have these really key moments, switch points, decision points maybe in some cases in their lives where lots of things change, and they're kind of what happens in that moment can be more important than what happens in some other moments. It's going from little protected, constrained world inside of an egg to the larger world with different physical environment, different natural enemies, access to external resources. It's a really big change. And early development, lots is changing about the abilities of the embryo. And so when to make a break and leave the egg, it has a lot of implications for survival, potentially for development. So focus on hatching as a critical life history switch point, and the integrative biology of early life stages. So I'm kind of generalist in some ways. I'm interested in behavior, I'm interested in physiology, I'm interested in ecology, I'm interested in evolution. I try to pull together, and relate all of these different kinds of elements of biology. So this is a great system for doing that. And another kind of big theme in what we do is phenotypic plasticity. So the fact that phenotype, the expressed characteristics of an organism, basically anything that you can see, anything that you could measure above the level of the DNA sequence, right? So behavior, morphology, physiology, all of these things are part of the phenotype. And the idea is that, we know this, we all know this intuitively, that a lot of stuff is context dependent, right? So what's possible, how an organism develops, depends on its external environment, on the resources available to it, on the conditions around it. That's true in a short-term, kind of moment-by-moment way, like, oh, you didn't get enough sleep last night, now you're not performing so well today. It's true on a longer-term sense. Somebody who's malnourished is not going to maybe grow to their full height that they could have had they had a better diet. Humans are incredibly plastic. And we can look at plasticity in lots of different ways, but kind of understanding the phenotype, understanding how organisms develop, how they express their different characteristics. Part of it is about the underlying genetic capacity, but then how that capacity is expressed in the phenotype, very context dependent. Some of it's inevitable, just like the environment impacts development, and some of it, which I think is really cool, and it's part of, the stuff that we study, is actually adaptively matched. So under different circumstances, the right thing to do is not always the same. And again, this is something that we know intuitively from situations that we deal with in our own lives. The right behavior, the right response to different situations is not always the same. How you're going to dress when you go to a job interview and when you go out with your friends, not the same. You're presenting, in some way, a different phenotype. The same thing for the eggs I study. The right time to hatch, if a snake is about to swallow you, is sooner than, if you're in like a totally safe environment. And lots of animals we know now, and plants, lots of organisms change their phenotype adaptively in response to their environment. So these little frog eggs that we study are a great system to look at adaptive plasticity. And now the current grant that we're working on is development of adaptive embryo behavior. And so we're looking at, as these little embryos are developing and they're changing, and what they can perceive is changing, essentially what they can know about the world, what they're capable of doing, their size, their strength, their other abilities, things like the size of their lungs. That affects what they can do, and it affects what they should do given different circumstances. So we're trying to tease that apart and understand it.
Great. So since you've started studying this area of hatching, what would you say would be the most significant findings or discoveries or bits of information that you have revealed in your research? If you could limit it to maybe 2 or 3.
Well, one of the things I think that is, and it's not just me, right? This is kind of, I think probably the biggest thing is, and it comes not just from my work, it comes from lots of other people's work, some of which is kind of stimulated, I think, by things that we've done. So when I first started working on this, and the initial discovery was embryos running away from snakes, basically, like snake-induced premature hatching. That was kind of a wild idea. It was not something that we thought of eggs as doing. We didn't think about embryos in eggs as like getting information about the world around them and like changing their behavior and changing their hatching time, making a decision, looking after themselves, essentially, having, this kind of defense. We just thought about hatching as like something that was developmental and, kind of part of a program that just played out, right? So this is kind of part of a shift of our thinking of development as much more plastic and more environmentally responsive, as well as environmentally impacted compared to how we used to think. And so when I started working on this, like, okay, red-eyed tree frogs, snake-induced hatching. It could have been just like some isolated anomaly. You want to stop it?
Okay.
Okay, we're recording?
Continue.
So when I started working on this, we thought that hatching was just this developmental thing. Might have been just one weird frog, right, that did this. But now the evidence has accumulated. Red-eyed tree frogs, for one, hatch and alter their hatching timing in response to lots of things. But we also know that lots of other frogs alter hatching in response to various kinds of risks and opportunities, and fish and turtles and lots of invertebrates, and it's just become this really broad phenomena that you look at eggs and you look at their ecology and their environment and you see like, okay, what are the things that actually could affect their survival in the egg or as like in their extreme youth after hatching. And you see like, well, there's so many experiments now that show adaptive plasticity in hatching in, animal after animal after animal. This seems now like a really widespread and broad thing. And it makes sense as a life history switch point. We would expect it to be plastic and we would expect it to be environmentally sensitive. So, metamorphosis, this was known for a long time. Things like the onset of reproduction, maturity, maybe things that have switches between habitats as they develop or at different sizes. All of these things we know are context dependent and respond to environmental variation. People just hadn't put hatching in that category, but now we know it is. So that's probably the biggest, thing. But then there are, other, like cool stories, like the whole vibrational cues thing. So like, how do embryos know that they're about to be eaten by a snake and they should run away, right? This is, that's an interesting question. And we found that they actually use the movement, the vibrational cues. So a snake comes along, starts biting on the egg mass, shakes the eggs, the embryos somehow feel it, and then they hatch. So, the whole vibrations as information story is another thing that's been kind of cool.
Because somehow they can determine the difference between that and, say, raindrops.
Absolutely, right. And so it's not just like anything that they could experience. I mean, it's a gelatinous blob of eggs hanging on a leaf in the rainforest. It's a very kind of jiggly, shaky little world in there. And most of that shakiness is not dangerous. So, they have to be a little discriminating.
Excellent.
And they are.
So where do you see the research going from here? Now that this field has kind of been established, where do you see it? Not your research in particular, but maybe others. Like, where does this lead us from here on out?
Well, I think, now that we've established that this is, this happens all over the place. One of the really nice things about red-eyed tree frogs is it's become an excellent system where we can now use embryo behavior, we can use adaptive plasticity and hatching to study things that are like about that, but they're also kind of representatives of a larger phenomena. So we can we can now, lots of animals, for instance, use vibrational information, and lots of prey use vibrations to detect predators, or predators use vibrations to find prey. How do you study that? Well, here we have a system where it's actually really tractable. So we can do vibration playback experiments, and we can figure out how do they tell the difference, and what are they using, and how does that change developmentally, and that kind of thing. So so we can use the behavior of embryos to study how animals use this information source. So that's one thing. We could essentially now use embryos to ask, all sorts of questions that you could ask about any animal, but it could be a lot harder to study with some other things. Like predator-prey interactions, not that easy to observe in most systems.
Right.
Not that easy to manipulate or to, kind of ask questions about. Development of behavior. So this is a big focus of the current grant. Development changes behavior. This, as a teacher, this is,
Sure.
everybody knows this, and there's all sorts of components of that and reasons behind that, and, consequences of this same thing at different stages are different. So again, here's a system where we can really tractably study that. We can pick it apart, and just over a period of like 3 or 4 days, these little animals are changing radically, and they're changing, what they can do, and they're changing what they do, and that's like, we don't have to study them for 16 years to see these changes in development.
Sure.
So that's another thing. So getting into the kind of more mechanistic detail with red-eyed tree frogs is one place this is going, and that's certainly part of the current grant. But another thing that I think where we are now is broader comparative work. So one of my graduate students is working on parent-embryo interactions in glass frogs. So very different system where we have parents, sometimes mothers, sometimes fathers, looking after eggs. So and the parents have their own agenda, if you will, costs and benefits. They're making decisions. The embryos, their environment is strongly impacted by what their parents do. They can't really make the parents do anything, but they can respond to like good parents, bad parents. And that's a really diverse group of frogs, and so we can look at the evolution of these things. So yeah, a broader comparative perspective is also part of where this is going.
Great. So if you could say that if there was any one thing that excites you the most about your research, what would you say it is?
Oh my God, one thing?
Yeah. If you had to designate, for you personally, the most important thing that you feel you're doing with the research, what impact is it having? What's it doing? What does it mean?
Well, those are two different questions actually that you just asked me.
True.
So let me try to answer them separately.
Sure.
The stuff that excites me the most, I love to see things, to make observations that challenge my preconceptions. That is like probably the most exciting thing. That when I think I understand something, maybe I think I know how something works from things that I've read, or from general received knowledge, or maybe from work that I've been doing for years. And then I'm like watching the animals, and they do something that is not what they're supposed to do. I'm like, oh, that is, like now I have to just like
the nature of science,
change
right?
what I was thinking, and like I was wrong, we were wrong, we don't understand this, how can we figure it out? It's like those are the door opening moments, right? So it's not, in some sense, it's not about being right? It's about figuring out where you're wrong and then like how that opens a way to a new way of thinking. So, in a sense, like the hatching plasticity in the beginning was like, nobody thought that eggs could do this. Nobody would have like a priori formulated this hypothesis like, oh, I think, that embryos are going to hatch early to run away from snakes. That's kind of a crazy idea. I mean, it came out of my field observations and thinking about it, and I don't know, maybe, I didn't think it was crazy at the time, but certainly when I talked to some people, they were like, that can't happen.
Well, you observed it in the field in that process.
Well, no, I did not observe it in the field. I saw lots of eggs getting eaten by snakes. And I had the experience, which you've now seen, of, basically, accidentally, in this case, physically disturbing a clutch that was, pretty close to when it would have hatched spontaneously, and tadpoles started popping out, and I was like, wow, I wonder, like, what if, right? And then I formed the hypothesis that I did the experiment, kind of coming from, like, taking what people knew about metamorphosis, applying it to hatching and saying hatching could be behavioral,
sure.
Right? Not because I saw them like hatching out so quickly. It's like, well, you could get away from a snake, sure you could, and they do. But it wasn't, like it didn't come from theory. Right? It came from observation with kind of an open mind, and then, another example. So another frog that we work on in the lab is the hourglass tree frog. So you've seen them around, little yellow tree frogs. They classically, it's another independent origin of terrestrial eggs and aquatic tadpoles. So they lay their eggs also on leaves overhanging ponds, same kind of habitats where red-eyed tree frogs live. And since I was working in the tropics, I knew that they were a terrestrial breeding frog. I've seen them breed terrestrially lots. Okay, I knew that. And then there's a pond here, Quarry Pond, which is kind of a nasty pond. We don't usually work there. It's actually kind of smelly and, it's like extremely buggy. Is that still recording? Okay. So we don't usually work there, but for some reason, I don't know, we needed more Abracatus eggs, and we're like, oh yeah, there's a good course at Quarry Pond, let's go get some there. And we're looking, and this is me, and I had, I don't know how many, but a lot of years of experience in finding terrestrial frog eggs, right? I'm good at it. My first PhD student, Justin Souchon, also had a bunch of years of experience of working with Abracatus then, good at finding terrestrial eggs. We're looking, we couldn't find them. And then we're like, okay, we just have to follow the frogs around because this is ridiculous. And then we saw that they're laying eggs in the water, which is totally not what they were supposed to be doing, right? Like any book that you would read would tell you that these frogs lay terrestrial eggs. And that just opened up all kinds of questions, and that, he's continuing that, right? He's now a professor at Vassar, and that's like, it's like his career frog. Like red-eyed tree frogs have been kind of my career frog. From these kind of surprising things where the received knowledge was wrong.
So I think we covered that for sure. Awesome. And in the second question, I think I'll recant that a little bit, and instead of asking what does it mean, maybe ask why would a person out there in the world, or not, I want to say why would it matter to them, but more like where would they find value in the research you're doing, and like how is this important in the bigger picture, throughout, not just,
Yeah, why should my grandma care?
Right. Exactly, not just like the community I or you are, which is professional communities where people find interest in these things, but perhaps a teenager in a high school classroom. Where would they find the value in this sort of research?
So I think there are actually like a few places where people connect with it depending on where they're coming from.
Sure.
So I think for some set of people, it's like cool stories about amazing organisms, right? And that's like, you know, they're beautiful, they're charismatic, they're fascinating, they live in cool places. You know, things like, you know, embryos have behavior. Embryos protect themselves from predators. Embryos discriminate vibrations. All of this, it's, you know, that has a certain kind of public appeal. You know, people like to watch nature documentaries, right? That kind of, I think that there's something, for many of us, you know, in the human psyche that is drawn to and values those kind of, you know, feeling of connection and coolness of other organisms in the natural world. So that's, you know, that's like the National Geographic crowd or something. People who like those kind of things. Another way of you know, connecting with the work is as a case study and as an example of plasticity, and thinking about plasticity and environmental effects on development. It's a hugely important thing in understanding, you know, understanding phenotypes, understanding why organisms are the way they are. You know, it's part of why we are the way we are, how our environments affect our development. Of course, you don't do experiments on people. You know, so understanding how plasticity and environmental effects on development and on phenotypes work is a pretty core thing about understanding life. And this is a good system for studying that. And it's a good system in part because we can do, you know, kind of the detailed lab work and stuff, and it's connected to the real world.
What do you mean by system, just to clarify?
So the frog and, you know, all the stuff that it interacts with in its world, things that impact on it, its natural enemies, its, yeah, etc.
Right.
So,
Go ahead.
No, there was one other thing I was going to say. What was it? Oh yeah. So that's, you know, that's kind of a better understanding how life works through red-eyed tree frogs.
Great.
You know, and I think we're learning things, you know, about life that are applicable to lots of other organisms, general principles, through this, you know, cool, intractable frog.
As living things, we might be interested in that.
And we are living things.
Right.
And our development is also impacted by the environment and all kinds of other organisms on which we, you know, rely, or, you know, are our enemies, are also infected by the environment. So that's, you know, part of, you know, practical things of having a basic understanding of how life works. Another kind of thing with applied implications is that youth is a dangerous time. So early life stages, eggs, larvae, they die a lot.
Sure.
You know, they die a lot in lots of different kinds of organisms, lots of kinds of organisms that we care about, you know, for instance, that we eat, or that we, you know, that are resources for us in one way or another, or whose, you know, whose well-being or existence in the world we care about. And so, you know, having a better understanding of the, you know, how these different kinds of risks and decisions and survival strategies play out in these early life stages, which, you know, really mostly die, right? The you know, the survival rate through the egg and, you know, tadpole stage is not that high. And understanding how that plays out is also, you know, potentially of general interest or of applied interest. So an example from this year, okay, it's been a crazy year with El Nino and super dry and not raining a normal amount. And, and stuff like that. You've been, may not have been the rainforest experience that you expected. It has not been raining that much here, and eggs are dying a lot from drying out at ponds. This is, maybe has implications thinking about impacts of global climate change on amphibians. We also have induced early hatching from eggs drying out, but understanding the ecology and survival strategies of early life stages has that value.
Sure. All right, I have one last question for you.
Okay.
So if you could give any advice to a budding scientist in their formative years, as perhaps a teenager or even earlier, what would you tell some of these young people about what they should be doing or looking forward to if they're interested in science or biology and those types of fields?
Oh, try things. Try things. There are like so many opportunities that you could have just to make observations, depending on where you are and what access you have. Maybe you can, get experience in a lab or something, or maybe you can watch the bugs in your backyard or, in a neighborhood park and observe things, think about them. Wherever you are, you can formulate hypotheses, you can make observations. To test those, you might observe something, that hasn't been seen before. This can still happen anywhere. Also, read, because there's lots of stuff that we already know. There's lots of stuff we think we know. It's not all right. And so that combination of looking at the world, observing, forming hypotheses, and thinking about ways to test them doesn't always have to be experimental. It can be observational. Juxtaposing that with reading, and see, does what I'm seeing in the world match up with what I'm reading? Are there things that I'm seeing that I can't find explanations for, or maybe nobody has looked at? Yeah, that's a place to start.
All right. Thank you very much, Karen.
You're welcome.
That was great. Any last comments or thoughts? You've certainly said enough, so it's not needed. If you have anything lingering from our conversation.
Another, I don't know if this is a general, like high school kind of level, but, along with the, look at the world and think about it and read is in some way you have to be a little stubborn sometimes about, following what you want and following up on your observations, because certainly when I was a student, there were times, actually this has happened more than once, where I saw something, I observed something, and I talked to somebody and they're like, "No, that can't happen," or "That's, you got that all wrong," and I was like, well, I think there's something there, and I'm gonna try to figure it out. And then it turned out to be something really cool, and have multiple papers on it. So, if you have an idea, if you have an observation, and you want to know more about it, you might need to be a little stubborn and push forward with that.
Right. So don't
have the
hesitate.
confidence in your ideas to test them.
Excellent. Alrighty. I think we will call it a day.
Okay. That's long.